Okay, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Fright Lab. I'm Lucas Yoakum. With me tonight, as always, is our fearless co-host, Joseph Wren. Joe, how excited are you to finally talk about slashers?
On the last episode of the Fright Lab, we talked to a fine director, a fine creator, a magnificent man, Mr. Ben Bigelow. He told us what can happen that can cause one's ears to bleed. Thine ears shall bleed. I'm still going to suggest you go and listen to that. Tonight, Lucas is going to talk about what happens when the rest of you decides to bleed. Because slashers are something we love in horror cinema, in horror audiobooks, in radio plays, whether it's a silent film about a masked serial killer or a crazy person. And then it gets really dark and really scary and really shocking, and it just gets gory and filthy and weird. This is going to be a 3-part series. I'm glad you're here today, all of you gruesome people. Thank you for listening to the show, and I'm going to sit back for a minute and let Lucas do what he does so well. Slashers Part 1. Take it away, sir.
Indeed. Los Angeles, California, 1985. A serial killer is on the loose. His target is primarily African-American sex workers. For 3 years, he was a menace. And then, in 1988, all of a sudden, his crimes stopped. The community around him began to relax, as much as any community in this situation can. Maybe the killer was caught, or dead, or simply moved on. Then, in 2002, victims matching the same social group began showing up dead, apparently from the same killer. This quote-unquote sleeping monster was apparently awake again. As a result, the killer is dubbed the Grim Sleeper. For several more years, Los Angeles is haunted by this bastard until he is arrested in 2010. The Grim Sleeper was actually a local mechanic and sanitation worker named Lonnie Franklin. It's a miracle he was caught at all. Because he was going after sex workers, the LAPD mostly tried to ignore his gruesome handiwork. It took the people of Los Angeles making noise to get anything done. Anyway, like so many other serial killers, he was an alarmingly normal person, at least externally. He didn't need a hockey mask, and he didn't rely on quippy one-liners before attacking his victims. Lonnie Franklin shares with most serial killers and mass murderers something simple. Think about it. Jeffrey Dahmer was a murderer and a cannibal, amongst many other things. Jerry Brudos tortured and strangled co-eds. Fred and Rose West not only went after local women, but their own children eventually. What isn't discussed most of the time, the thing that all of these characters share, these are just people. Jerry Brudos worked on electronics. Dahmer, well, he was a drunk who worked at a chocolate factory. Fred West, a handyman, and Rose West, a homemaker. When these very real visions of horror aren't engaged in their nefarious doings, in the end, they are just people. Now, I know that doesn't help anyone feel better. The thought that your auto mechanic might be a murderer is chilling at best. But, statistically speaking, you are more likely to be killed by a family member, friend, or neighbor than a stranger. Here are some statistics lifted directly from a fact sheet published by the FBI. I will include a link to that sheet in the show notes. Go check it out. To start, this is data from 2011, so the numbers will have changed some by the time we're recording this, August of 2024, but it is a good representative set of data from around the time of the Grim Sleeper killings, or at least directly in their aftermath. According to the FBI, relating to incidents of murder for which the relationships of murder victims and offenders were known, 54.3% were killed by someone they knew, an acquaintance, neighbor, friend, boyfriend, etc. 24.8% of victims were slain by family members. The relationship of murder victims and offenders was unknown in 44.1% of murder and non-negligent manslaughter incidents in 2011. unquote. Moreover, quote, single victim, single offender situations accounted for 48.4% of all murderers, unquote. Of all of the homicides for which the FBI received weapons data, most, and that's about 67.8%, involved the use of firearms. Handguns comprise 72.5% of all firearms used in murder and non-negligent manslaughter incidents in 2011. All of that is to say, you aren't going to be killed by Leatherface. The reality of serial killers and their crimes is entirely closer to Frank Zito in Maniac than of Michael Myers. So tonight, and for the next 2 episodes, Joe and I are going to be talking about the slasher subgenre of horror. I've been mostly wanting to ignore this particular subgenre, but the time has come that we have to grapple with this one. I must give credit where credit is due. The idea for these episodes came from Joe. Should we give this man a round of applause for doing that? Come on, everybody, let's do that, please.
I'm the editor. I can do that.
Okay, that works for me. That works for me. So, for the audience, that conversation happened after one particularly raucous night of recording where we were up quite late working, and we started talking about how do you talk about slashers. And one of my big arguments at that time was that it's not really easy to do. We'll kind of go into this a little bit further, but it eventually became obvious that we were going to have to break it apart into 3 distinct sections. You guys have no doubt read the title of this episode by now, the Prehistory. So we'll elaborate on that further as we go in. I mean, I wasn't kidding in the beginning of the episode, Joe, when I said, how excited are you to finally cover this? Because I feel like slashers are the gorilla in the living room that no one wants to talk about when you're talking about high-minded sides of horror.
I agree today because we spent so much time in the past few years really talking about comic book movies and torture porn. And the Saw franchise might have started that, but they didn't stop the ride when it came to how much gore can we throw at the screen. That idea in and of itself is old school, but I think there is a difference between a bad guy trying to kill everybody on the screen and a psychopath who has put you into a situation that will result in maiming and gore and death. They're disturbing for different reasons, but slashers are at the start of horror. How difficult is it to talk about the history of slashers and not talk about Jack the Ripper?
Oh, okay.
I think that's the original serial killer slasher story. And it's a story that maybe they finally solved, but hundreds of years too late, or 100 years too late for anyone to get any satisfaction. But that is a story that was spread through the population. It was a myth. Jack the Ripper, nobody knew who that was. Fast forward to the silent movie era. Now we're talking about vampires, and we're talking about the Phantom of the Opera, and you move forward even to Hitchcock. And when you get to Psycho, you've got a high bar. The scary bad guy is something that really starts horror for me.
I'm fairly certain that a much better educated member of our audience will be able to correct me if I'm wrong. But I want to say one of Hitchcock's first films was a silent film about a character based on Jack the Ripper. So that's kind of an interesting little tie-in to some things we've been talking about both privately and on the air. I would love one day to talk about Jack the Ripper. We've talked about that a little bit on the show before. I don't exactly remember under what episode. Look back somewhere in our last 40 episodes and it's there. But there's been a lot of ink spilt about that subject. And again, I always go back to my biggest frustration with it is the thing that Alan Moore ultimately said about it. You have hundreds of years or over 100 years of conversation about who was Jack the Ripper, and at no point do we ever ask who were his victims, And of course, these were quote unquote commoners. These were normal people, and these were street level sex workers in Victorian Britain. They were the Victorian Britain equivalent of the less dead. There was no accounting for their history all that much. Other people have spent a lot of time talking about it, and frankly, I am not a ripperologist, which is kind of like, I don't know. I wouldn't want to be publicly referring to myself as a ripperologist. Call me crazy. Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting one. One of these days we will get into that.
That's where all of this starts for me, at least. That's the earliest example I can think of one person who mysteriously killed people, women, sex workers. It was an unsolved horror. So that is your boogeyman. That's where it starts. But with slashers, what we think of as a slasher film, I think starts with Psycho and eventually turns into many of the films Lucas is going to discuss in this series. Yeah. I'm looking forward to this, and I don't want to spoil it, so please, once again.
One of these days, I will get into Psycho, because I don't necessarily think that Psycho is a slasher, though. If you wanted to create an episode 0 of this series of totally pure proto-slashers, then yeah, sure, maybe. But, initially I wanted to, ignore this subgenre for a few reasons. To start, the whole subgenre has a stink, an odor of exploitative trash on it. For every genuinely scary or interesting movie in this field, and I would include a movie like From Hell in that category, there are a couple of just genuinely awful movies to sort through on top of it. And like so many other subgenres, the best movies in the field seem to have happened early, with latter-day entries into the series, whatever series it might be, starting to become of decreasing quality. And finally, I find a good many slasher films to be offensive purely to offend. I am not a shrinking violet when it comes to on-screen gore or violence, but I have a limited stomach for sexualized violence, There are plenty of criticisms of horror cinema that I can ignore or debate with, but I can't argue that many of these movies kind of cheapen violence, whether that's sexual violence or otherwise, to mere titillation, right? Look back to our first episode of The Fright Lab, where we discussed Ms. 44. I still think that movie's a fascinating time capsule, and it's a worthy entry into the greater canon of horror movies. But let's not mince words here about Ms. 44, okay? The main character is raped twice, more or less entirely on screen in a 20-minute span. It's simply a plot device, a doorway into the main character's violence, and not much else. It's cheap and it's ugly. Maybe I'm asking too much of an early Abel Ferrara movie, but you understand my point. So, as always, I think it would be extremely helpful if we lay out some things up front. Most importantly, what is a slasher movie?
Hey everybody, it's Joe from the future. There will be a link in the show notes to our first episode, but you will notice that the title of that film is Ms. 45. Lucas absolutely said Ms. 44. I assure you, he meant Ms. 45. When you get into some of the subjects in these episodes, you might understand why that auto-corrected to 44. So we're going to let him have this one. He's on a roll.
Son of a bitch. There is a part of me that wants clear and clean definitions for things. Our audience can imagine that my Google search history is a veritable smorgasbord of weird sentences. Thankfully, if you are looking for the definition of slasher films, the internet is awash with helpful ideas. For instance, the University of Kentucky published a research guide outlining the basics of slasher films, as well as some examples. Now, for whatever reason, they have this listed under a subheading marked Basics of a Splatter Film. As Joe can attest, everyone needs a good editor. Anyway, here is their definition. Quote, slasher films are a genre of horror most popular from the late 50s to the early 90s, defined by its use of a generally masked killer harassing and murdering groups of people. The genre and its popular films created many of the tropes we see in horror today, and many franchises have been spawned out of these films. Unquote. Already, we can see an issue here. They cite movies like Psycho, Child's Play, and It Follows as slashers. None of these movies really involve masks or masked groups of people being killed. Studio Binder, which offers software for helping with movie production and other resources, offers this definition for slashers. Quote, "The slasher film is a horror subgenre that meets certain criteria, including an effective killer, a high body count, and non-firearm weapons. These criteria can sometimes be open to interpretation or debate, but those are the basic requirements of a slasher," unquote. Okay, this is a pretty good definition, and the list they provide on their site is pretty helpful, albeit not the last word on the subject. Finally, Industrial Scripts offers us this, quote, "A slasher movie is a horror subgenre that involves the murdering of a number of people by a psychopathic killer, typically via a knife or a bladed tool, such as a scythe. In general, the horror genre is known for fear, violence, and terror. It will typically feature a menacing villain, whether it be a monster or a supernatural evil spirit, for example. But a slasher movie specifically can prey on audiences' most palpable fears. It boils down the horror genre to simple terms. A crazed killer with a crude weapon on the hunt for blood." End quote. This is an extremely helpful set of guidelines, if a bit flexible or incomplete. So, we can say that a slasher film is about a murderer, typically armed, not always supernatural, who kills more than one person, oftentimes in shockingly gruesome ways. Seems like a reasonable definition to me. Joe, do you have any objections here?
I was rolling with that third one. That is the best definition of what a slasher is. You can have a slasher film that includes a killer. And what is the difference between a slasher and a killer? I would argue a slasher is supernatural, even if it's a mystery who it is. Child's Play, great example. That's one guy who killed people, usually with a big knife, and decided to do something supernatural to extend his life, a la Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, and the myth of Michael Myers in the first Halloween film and the second film. You thought you got him, but he got away, and ultimately would keep coming back. And that ties into that sequel problem that we all had for a while with these major names in slasher cinema. But a killer, what's the difference? To me, a killer is what you have in Scream.
Okay.
They're still smart. They're not just a bumbling tank coming to kill you. It's more psychological, and it's trying to fake you out who the murderer actually is. There's a difference there, but I think they both play a part in the same ballpark.
Listen, I have to take exception with you using the phrase "a bumbling tank." Listen, Leatherface may be a vicious murderer, but he's somebody's beloved baby boy, you know?
That's true, and eventually he would become somebody else's baby boy, lest we forget the glory that is Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation. It's the greatest film Matthew McConaughey's ever been in. I don't know what you're talking about.
I hadn't said anything. So, back on subject, right? The list that we've given, especially from Industrial Scripts, they're good. They do help us out a lot, but I think that leaves us with some issues, right? What's the difference, if we're going to talk of all of these definitions, what's the difference between Frank from Maniac and the Sawyer family from Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Can we really consider Maniac a slasher when it's technically in the same genre with the Friday the 13th series and its magical zombie icon killer, Jason Voorhees? Well, here's where things get a little sticky, right? Genre is useful as a map, but it absolutely isn't the whole of the territory. So we need to abandon the notion of monolithic slashers subgenre-wise and think of it as having just useful facets. Like some awful gore-soaked gem, you know? Slashers have many dimensions. For the rest of this episode, I want to talk about the prehistory of slasher films. However, I am stuck with the reality that this is something too hard to do in a space of about 20 or 30 minutes. Because genre is an artistic construct and not a scientific system, I can't really point to a single film and say, this is clearly the first one. Instead, I've picked 3 movies that might help set the stage, with the promise of a fourth that seemed to really set the ball rolling. We have briefly discussed the peculiar subgenre of Giallo in previous episodes. While Dario Argento might be one of the best-known Giallo creators, there is arguably one name that stands head and shoulders above the entire field: Mario Bava. I genuinely think that Bava is in the rare position of being a genuine artist. Giallo is a subgenre that can be silly at good times and absolute exploitation trash at the worst. It's hard to look at a movie like Black Sunday from 1960 and not see a genius at work. It's spooky and atmospheric, but beautifully composed and directed. In 1964, Bava released Blood and Black Lace.
A house of high fashion, a dazzling whirl of elegance, of exotic, extravagant beauties. An adventurous journey into the devastating allure of the most sophisticated women and their intimate secrets.
Suddenly, these lace curtains ignite a drama that will lacerate your emotions. Blood and Black Lace. Who is this shrouded, sadistic, sordid fiend who maims and murders? Why this bloodthirsty orgy, this holocaust of lives? Blood and Black Lace in bleeding color. Shattering, shivering, shocking.
You know, they just don't make trailers like that anymore.
No, because everything they tell you in a trailer is a lie.
So, the plot of Blood and Black Lace is honestly pretty straightforward. An Italian fashion house is under attack from a masked killer. Lesser directors, and especially those in the slasher subgenre, would turn this into a grisly affair and little more. But Bava makes this whole thing feel both artistic and grim. The movie feels positively chaste in comparison to a good portion of the Giallo field. But I personally see most of the DNA of the early slasher genre in this film, if only by the presence. Our antagonist might not be an according to Hoyle serial killer, but they do absolutely get kills with new brutality in every scene. Okay, then fast forward to 1971, and Bava releases A Bay of Blood. In a lot of ways, I think this movie captures the sort of bonkers energy that many of the 1980s slashers would rely upon. But what it lacks in sincerity and solid direction, quite frankly, it makes up for with just sheer violence. Bava really took the gloves off here. It might be something of an absurd mess, but if you like the sillier aspects of slashers, A Bay of Blood is a must-see. However, the third and final film in the prehistory of slashers is maybe one of the most recognizable films in the history of horror. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, directed by Tobe Hooper, released in 1974.
What happened was true. The most bizarre and brutal series of crimes in America.
The sound of the camera is iconic in this trailer.
Without watching the trailer, I would know this movie by the sound design.
Stop!
Honest to God.
This is the movie that is just as real, just as close,
Crazy! You gotta make us stop!
just as terrifying as being there. Even if one of them survives, what will be left? The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. After you stop screaming, you'll start talking about it.
Who will survive, and what will be left of them? That's what the poster for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre reads, and it's an utterly apt question to ask. Few movies seem to capture the surreality of violence as this film. But there is something funny in that thought, you know? Hear me out. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is very, very loosely based on the crimes of people like Ed Gein. Joe, do I need to explain who Ed Gein is?
For those that do not know, I think it's worth an explanation. I would like to mention that they made a biopic of Ed Gein that really, really borrows from the legacy of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But there are things in this film, this very famous film, that tried to scare you the same way Hitchcock scared you with Psycho, where he told you a story and he made you believe it. What was the story with that film? You have to see it from the beginning.
Yeah.
The story of Texas Chainsaw Massacre was, this happened. This really happened. And though nobody said it, not that I could find, it was heavily implied that some of this footage was real. And that was the feeling of just ick and gore that brought this film to the front of everybody's attention. But please talk about Ed Gein and what he did, because that's a sick man.
Yeah. Okay, so Ed Gein, old Eddie Gein. Ed Gein was a murderer from Wisconsin in the 1950s. He was raised by an incredibly overbearing religious mother and a mostly distant father. He had a single brother who died fairly young. He died in his, I believe, 20s. There's rumors that Ed may have killed him, but there's no proof of it, and the story is long gone, so what do we do? So Ed Gein, after the death of his mother, kind of lost his mind. And Eddie didn't particularly have it together all that well in the first place. He was always, shall we say, a bit of an oddball, if you go back and watch the old footage about the Ed Gein crimes. So Ed became a grave robber and then proceeded to murder two women who lived in his town, who both very, very strongly resembled his mother in a very eerie way. He proceeded to how do I put this? Well, there's no way to put this delicately. He proceeded to field dress them like deer, and then he proceeded to make things from their body, up to and including a costume of a woman's body made from their body parts. It's an incredibly macabre story, and of all of the kind of golden age, quote unquote, killers, one, Ed Gein is not technically a serial killer, really, when you get right down to it. And two, I don't know, he's almost sympathetic because he was a clearly deeply disturbed person with identity issues who needed a lot of help. And I think in the modern era, it'd be a very different story. But 1950s Plainfield, Wisconsin is not exactly the hotbed of psychiatric treatment. So, yeah, Ed Gein. So, going back to what Joe was saying, and this, I don't know, does this make matters worse? Makes matters better? I don't know. The film is presented as a true story, even though the actual events of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre are 100% fiction. So, for those weaknesses, though, the movie is starkly effective, even now. For instance, the entire cast is made of Texas locals, so the acting feels very raw and very real. Further, there is the way the movie is shot. The movie had a budget equivalent to about $800,000 modern dollars, which for a big screen film isn't much. But it's shot in this way that feels sunbleached. It's more like a war documentary or fiction. I think Tobe Hooper may have had some background in that. I don't know, honestly. I've never really studied the man's life. The violence of this movie is really immediate and in your face. Every hammer blow, every swing of a chainsaw, every scream in your ear feels real. Now, listen, I love the two aforementioned Bava joints, but there is always an element of ironic distance in them. The artistry of it creates this extra layer of separation. And you might be sympathetic to the victims of Blood and Black Lace. But at no point do I feel like you're being threatened in that movie. Texas Chainsaw is the first horror film, I think, that hits like that you don't feel safe while you're watching it. So, to recap, Blood and Black Lace basically set the stage for the modern slasher, the story of a murderer with a novel appearance menacing a group of people. A Bay of Blood outlined the sort of broad spectrum insanity for modern slashers. Not only does a slasher need to be violent, it doesn't need to necessarily make sense to be fun and at least somewhat coherent. Slashers have a logic of sorts, and these two Bava movies illustrate them perfectly. And with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Tobe Hooper found the platonic ideal for horror violence, the way to make the absurd situation feel very real.
And how often was that borrowed by other directors?
I would argue that no Texas Chainsaw, no other slasher. I think that movies like that and Maniac set such a stage and such a high bar that I don't know that many other movies, other than the last movie we're going to talk about in this unintentional quadrology, I don't think that any one of them would have reached those heights without them. You might have had a Jason Voorhees, but without Texas Chainsaw and Blood and Black Lace, I don't buy it. I don't buy that. And that's just me, and I could be wrong. I would love to hear from our fans about that. You can always email us at thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com or talk to us on Letterboxd or Instagram or Facebook. Did I mention we now have a Facebook page? There's a lot of ways you can reach us to talk about that. We will touch on all of that as well as some more housekeeping at the end of this episode. I'm going to make something of a tortured analogy here, but I feel that Bava and Hooper are the parents of this final film we're going to discuss in this episode. And I feel silly making that comparison because the director of this movie is someone I have an immense love for, creatively speaking. Long-term fans of the show will not be surprised by this, but I am, of course, referring to John Carpenter's absolute horror opus, Halloween, from 1978. Now, I'm sure my decision to cover Halloween doesn't come as any surprise. Even if you aren't into slashers, Halloween is one of those rare, transcendent movies. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre might be a little too grim for many audiences, but Halloween seems to cross a lot of boundaries of individual taste. I know so many people who can't make it through an October 31st, to say nothing of just an entire month of October, without watching this movie. Halloween tells the story of Lori, a young woman just trying to have a nice, quiet, uneventful Halloween night. Unfortunately for her, Michael Myers has come back to his hometown. Michael was put into a mental institution as a child for brutally murdering his sister, coincidentally on Halloween night. See, Michael escaped during an attempted transfer of institutions. Needless to say, things get absolutely intense. Halloween sort of has it all. There's moments of genuine comedy, shocking attacks, an utterly inexplicable ending, and arguably the best theme in horror history. You heard it earlier, that reverential silence? I don't have it for many other horror themes. Man, it's good.
So good.
I don't need to tell you how good Carpenter's scores are. Goddamn, I love that song. If you haven't heard his most recent song that he released this year, 2024, go check out the song My Name is Death, and there will be a link to it in the show notes. I think Halloween really is like the text of what we would come to think of as the slasher. It's certainly one of the most endearing series of films, with the most recent entry to it coming out in 2022. We've sat with the Halloween series for 44 years as of the time of this recording. All total, we have 12 movies with Michael Myers to sort through. Alas, I do have to exclude Halloween 3 Season of the Witch from this discussion, but it's such a convoluted subject, I can't get into it here. Sadly.
How do you feel about the most recent trilogy of films in the series?
I haven't bothered with them, actually.
Really?
No, not in the slightest. I'm not interested in them. You know me. I am a contrarian, and I don't want to bother with them. I'm sure they're good. People who have better horror taste than me have already told me that the last two of the most recent Halloween movies are excellent. I'm sure they are. I will probably at some point watch them, if only to get kind of caught up on the, I don't know, the oxygen of the horror world. But I don't care. I think the story's been told. And I think anything after this, and with all due respect to Carpenter, his legend, Jamie Lee Curtis, who played Laurie Strode, with all due respect to all of them, I don't ever want to seem like I am the expert on Halloween and no one should listen to anyone but me here. But I feel like the story's been told, and anything further that we're trying to get from it is just extrapolation, just revision, I guess there's a time and place for that. I will always go back to the example that I think I cited in episode 4 or 5 on Suspiria, where I talked about a movie not as a remake but as a cover song. There was a creator of The Haunted Hippie who's on YouTube. You should follow her. She rules. She talks about the idea of thinking of a sequel sometimes, or a remake, not as a remake but as a cover of a song. Tears for Fears' Mad World is a sad song, but it wasn't until Gary Jules redid it that it suddenly becomes the song that you want to slash your wrist to. It is, there is such a thing as a song becoming definitive in another person's hand. Like, listen, Joe will appreciate this. I like Black Sabbath's Supernaut. It's a fun song, but I much prefer the 1000 Homo DJs cover of Supernaut, because holy shit, it's good, despite the name 1000 Homo DJs. It's a bit insensitive.
I'm going to let you have that one, and I'm going to appeal to you in the summer of 2024 when we're recording this. If there's ever an opportunity for us to watch movies and drink beer, can we watch the new Halloween films this October? And I want to appeal to your need to be correct, because the new Halloween films have some very good ideas, but they start out with a premise that I'm not a fan of. They sold it as everything in this film, and I'm talking about the first of the Halloween films that came out in the last 5 years, by telling us that all the sequels don't matter, and we're only following John Carpenter's original Halloween. Well, if that's not the biggest fan service I've ever heard, that's what everybody wants. I want to live in a world where everything from this point forward follows Star Wars. Not A New Hope, not anything else. And I'm being absurd, because that's the ultimate fan fiction. We're going to throw out all the sequels, even the good ones, and say, this follows all of that. The first Halloween that came out a couple years ago is worth your time. The second one is worth your time if you've had a couple beers. And the third one, I would argue against what you've been told. I don't think it's that good.
I will take that under advisement. I actually spent part of my day today working on my 31 for 31 list this year, and unfortunately there's no space left in the list because my 31 for 31, as fans of the show will already know, is more like 42 for 31 in most cases. I watch a lot of horror in October. I mean, I watch a lot of horror to begin with, but I watch a lot of horror in October. So I will keep that in mind. We will have to off air do that one of these nights. But the idea of drink beer, watch movies, we'll get to that at the end of this episode. Again, we have a little bit of house cleaning to do. So back to our original point. These movies are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of slashers, or for that matter, the genesis of slashers. There are a lot of movies that you could discuss in this regard, or just playing around with the question, what makes a slasher? That can be a fun conversation, right? So would you say that Hellraiser is a slasher? Is Nightbreed a slasher? Well, in both cases, I'd say no, or not necessarily. But I absolutely would agree with a lot of arguments to the contrary, How about the Puppet Master series, or at least the first 3, because there's 14 of them? Is a character like Dracula a sort of proto-slasher? And what really separates a slasher villain from a straight-up monster? What's the difference between a monster movie and a slasher movie? So, going back to the top of the episode, I don't want to put forward the idea that anything we are saying here is gospel truth. Again, genre is a helpful set of parameters or guideposts. And in the next 2 episodes, we are going to hopefully get into and shed light on the rise and fall of slashers. So I will have to humbly ask 2 things of our audience. First, I will have to ask their forgiveness in my presumptions. And perhaps more importantly, the second thing I need to ask, what do you think? What movies would you use to describe as the origins of the slasher subgenre? Or what would you say are the parents of this genre and other genres, You should let us know. We can always be contacted at thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com. We can also be found on Instagram as fright_lab_pod. We can also be found on Letterboxd as FrightLabPod. So some house cleaning I need to do real quick. Like I said earlier, we are now on Facebook. It's kind of late coming, I admit, and it's something that is going to just look kind of like that and the desiccated husk that is also our Twitter account, which I still keep active because it's very useful for talking to you guys. That said, you can reach us now on Facebook if you're into that sort of thing. I understand if you aren't. Another thing I want to just kind of briefly promote, and I admit this is shameless self-promotion on my behalf, but a few weeks ago, I was published. So I wrote an article for horrorobsessive.com.
Well done, sir.
I'll accept my Nobel Prize later. HorrorObsessive.com is a super cool online horror magazine, and they do the thing that I love to do. They dive deep into horror subjects. So I wrote an article for them titled, "When Exorcism Turns Deadly, the Real Horror Behind the Crucifixion." It's about the movie The Crucifixion and the real-life exorcism case of Tanaku, Romania. It is a deep dive article, the way that I like to deep dive into subjects. They very graciously published me, and I'm super happy. I'm going to be publishing some more there too, hopefully, fingers crossed, but my editor doesn't mind me saying that. But yeah, if you will go to horrorobsessive.com, you can find my article. It should be near the top page. So yeah, there is that. Finally, I want to pose a question to our audience and kind of leave it open a little bit with Joe as well. We have been talking, and we're finally kind of coming to the conclusion that we need to push our Discord. Joe, what's our Discord name?
Discord.thefrightlab.com.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I want more people to be showing up on Discord to talk because it's a good time. Also, the reason why I want more people there is we are talking about launching a Patreon. It is time. that we start being able to give you guys more. And the only way, unfortunately, we can do that is if some of this is paid for. So if you are interested in that, let us know. We have an idea for a Patreon perk that we're thinking about, something that we're kind of kicking around that we're calling it Drink Beer, Watch Movies, which is a way for us to drink beer and weirdly watch movies with our audience and chat and have a good time. So if you're interested in that, please let us know. Joe, I know that you are always up to your throat in a bunch of other projects. Can you tell our audience where else they might find stuff you're working on?
You have given so many new pieces of information that I have to tell the listener to look at the show notes. We have links to all of these things. All the articles and trailers and films that we talked about in this episode are linked down below. This amazing article written by my wonderful co-host and friend Lucas, and all of those social links, because we live in a time when everyone has a preference about how they want to consume their media. And the best part about having that Facebook group for us is now that's an option available for you. But I want everyone to come to the Discord server. That's where the conversation is continuing. We're building that community there, talking about horror movies, playing video games. Lucas has a record on Vampire Survivors. I still cannot figure out how he did it, where he had to kill the game because the game would not die. Myself and my friends. You can find us at thedamnitjanets.com. Yes, I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes because that is my band, and we are playing all the spooky songs that we love to play. Hopefully it's a good time. It's growing every single day. If you are a fan of heavy metal music and heavy metal topics, you need to listen to all of the podcasts we are creating at discussmetal.com. We talk about your favorite bands, my favorite bands, heavy metal topics, and everything in between. I have gotten so many questions about where is the Author and Punisher episode. I'm going to lean on Lucas a little bit and summon the King of Metal because we're going to have to make that happen very soon. What I want you to do right now is take out your phone, scroll to the left, the right, the up, the down, find the place to give the thumbs up, give the 5-star review. If this is your first episode of the Fright Lab, thank you for listening. If this is not your first episode, thank you for listening. We really appreciate you, and we really want to hear from you. You have all the ways. We are listening, and we are listening for you the way you've listened to us. Lucas, tell everyone how much we love independent artists and independent media.
You know, we had a recent conversation with Ben Bigelow, the director of Thine Ears Shall Bleed and The Desert, and he reaffirmed for me something that I deeply believe. Independent media is the way of the future. And I feel like podcasts, musicians, writers, whatever you're doing, if you're doing something scary, if you're doing something horror adjacent, we want to know about it because we really do want to build a community of DIY horror thinkers. And we're doing that at all of the listed emails and social media outlets we have. And, as always, The Fright Lab is written by me, Lucas Yoakum. Mr. Joseph Wren is our fearless producer and co-host. We appreciate each and every one of you, and we will talk to you all again very soon.